Let's take a deep breath. Close our eyes. And we see in the middle of our mind a little ball of golden light. We watch this light as it begins to grow, larger and larger, until now it covers the entire inner vision of our mind. And we see for ourselves within this light a beautiful temple. We see a garden that surrounds the temple and a body of water that flows through the garden. We see that the inside of the temple is lit as well by this same beautiful golden light. And we are here, for we have been drawn together by the power and in the presence of God. We devote our time spent together and all of our relationships and experiences of each other to Him. And we pray that His most Holy Spirit be upon us. And may we thus be lifted above and beyond the limitations, the sorrows, and the fears of this world to the endless love and peace that lay beyond. And so it is. Together, we all say, Amen. You know, the Dalai Lama said that in order to heal the world, we must have a plan. But he said, no plan will work unless we meditate. So what he spoke to there, of course, is something very similar to what Martin Luther King was saying when he said that we must have a quantitative shift in our circumstances as well as a qualitative shift in our souls. So both men were describing the formula for the transformation of the world, which includes both outer action and internal activism. And the spiritual activism to which Dr. King referred had to do with, he said, do not mistake our outer passivity. We are spiritually active. He said we're spiritually active in that we allow ourselves to resist any temptation to avoid an effort at moral persuasion. But he also said that moral persuasion is nearly impossible when the other person can feel your underlying contempt. We have very little power, he said, of moral persuasion when the other person can feel our underlying contempt. Now, I went to Washington, D.C. this weekend. I went to the Women's March. How many people participated in the Women's March? The first day that I went, the day of the inauguration, my friend who I was there with said, come on, Marianne, we're going to go to some protests on the day of the inauguration. But I knew I was going to be at the march the next day, and the day of the inauguration, I didn't want to protest. I wanted to be part of a larger national ritual that is the inauguration of a new president, and I wanted to find God that day. I knew the next day was going to be the day of the march, but that day, I didn't want to be about that. I wanted to find something spiritual. And I often feel when I'm in Washington, D.C., I feel that spirit when I go to the Lincoln Memorial. So I wanted to go to the Lincoln Memorial and meditate there. But they had had the big inaugural concert in front of the Lincoln Memorial the day before. And so when I went there, there were all these men who were dismantling the stagecraft, and so you couldn't get into the entrance to the Lincoln Memorial. But of course, I had made my goal to find God that day, and of course, God is not in any one geographical area. So I started walking around the mall and all of that. And what I saw were many people. I took some pictures, put them on my Instagram. Some people said, you're mocking these people. I wasn't mocking them at all. It was quite wonderful on both days, actually, some of the get-ups that people had on. But the day of the inauguration, I saw a lot of people with their Trump signs and their Trump outfits and so forth. And there was this one young man, and he had Trump pants and Trump top and Trump hat, and it was all Trump, 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 and American flag and Trump. And then he was with an older man, it turned out to be his father, who had some Trump buttons, etc. So I asked the young man, since his getup was so amazing, I said, do you mind if I take your picture? And he said, no. On both days, people were like, yeah. If you said during the march, may I take a picture of you with your sign? Yeah, people wanted it. People wanted it with all the Trump paraphernalia as well. So I had taken a picture of this young man, and the good thing was that I didn't have any kind of signage on, so, you know, these people didn't know me. They didn't know where I was coming from, and I And I said, sir, so you guys are all excited because of Trump's inauguration, obviously. And he said, yes. And I said, sir, what is your biggest hope? What is your biggest hope for this? And he said, well, we're going to get rid of the elites. The elites aren't going to run things anymore. And I said, well, aren't you just a little worried that he is one? And they said, and he said what he said, and then he also said with great sincerity, he said, what has Obama done for me? What has Obama done for me? What has Obama done for me? And that day, I wasn't the day to go into it. I didn't want to go into it. The Course in Miracles, I wanted to find God that day. And God is not a theory, God is an experience. And the Course in Miracles says that the primary responsibility of the miracle worker is to accept the atonement for himself. So as a Course in Miracles student, my job was to surrender to God any walls in my own mind that exist between me and that man. And the good news is it wasn't hard to do. These were nice people. They were very nice people. At one point, the young man was talking about how, I said, but what about all the bankers and all the billionaires and the elitists who are in his cabinet? And he said, well, we don't blame people for being successful in America. I said, no, of course not. I said, and he said, but they're good business people. They're good business people. I said, I understand they're good business people. I said, but isn't that like saying someone is a really good airplane pilot, so I should let him do my heart surgery? And at that moment, the man looked a little bewildered. But anyway, my job was to have no judgment in my heart. My job was to find that place of divine neutrality, which was not hard to do. Like I said, these people were nice. But I also knew that Martin Luther King line. One of the reasons they were nice to me is because I had surrendered my judgment. If they had felt for me this hipper than thou, or holier than thou, or smarter than that, whatever, that we're all tempted to about the people who don't agree with us politically, then it would not have been the space that it was. Now, when these men walked away, I said to him, I said, God bless you, sir. And he said, God bless you, ma'am. And then we both said, God bless America. And we both meant it. Now, he walked away. Those two men walked away. And this is very much what the Course in Miracles is about. That was a moment of a miracle for me, a shift in my own thinking, which is what a miracle is. Because I saw, you know, if you try to relate to someone else's culture or someone else's ethnicity or someone else's race or someone else's nationality or someone else's religion, you are by definition trying to join them on the level of an externality. And there is no real joining on the level of the externals, on the level of the category, on the level of the label. The only true joining is on the level where there is nothing you have to join because you are one. And that is why our job is to find some divine neutrality. Now, I knew that it was important, though, because I knew that two things happened there. I walked away knowing these are nice people. I might think they got conned, but that's just my political opinion. But these are nice people. And I also understand the argument, but they acquiesce with a racist bigot. I understand all that, but that wasn't the day for this for me. It was a day for me to just join on the level of the oneness. And I knew that I walked away and that I had made my intention that day to find God, and that God had shown me, that Spirit had guided me to that interaction with those two people. And I also knew something else, that not only did I walk away having been reminded of the innocence of my brothers, even though they are brothers with whom I politically disagree, I knew the same thing happened on their side. I knew that they saw that, he said, yeah, you probably voted for Hillary, but he didn't say it with contempt or anything. I said, yes, sir, I did. I said, but you know, this is the day of a new president, and we're all hopeful for our country on this day. And I knew that he walked away also, having an experience that I think busted his stereotypes as well. Now, the same thing happened to me the next morning. I was checking into a hotel, and someone had gotten me, my friend Lisa had gotten me a big a sash for the march. It's one of those sashes that looks kind of like the women's suffragettes. It said March on Washington. But I couldn't get it on right, and I couldn't figure out, well, is it supposed to face me this way? Is it supposed to be faced that way? And then it comes with this safety pin that they say is a replica of those that are made in World War II, which is much like the ones the suffragettes used, and they're harder to use, but I thought this was so cool because it's got this historical significance. So I'm like trying to figure this out, and this woman comes up to me in line. She said, honey, do you need some help? You need some help with that sash? And I said, oh, thank you so much. Yes, ma'am. And I said, and she's helping me, and she's putting, I said, you going to the march? And she went, absolutely not. But she continues to help me with my sash, which I thought was interesting. And then her husband was standing right there, and I said, well, where are you guys from? And he said, Indiana. And I said, oh, well, then you probably know Mr. Pence. He said, yes, ma'am, we do. I said, well, he's sane. And I said, you know, Mr. Trump and Mr. I said, but I didn't say it with sarcasm. It was the only thing I could come up with at the moment that was my heart's truth. But I said, and he said, well, he's a good businessman, the whole good businessman thing again. And then the woman said to me, and she said, I love this one, we have got to get our fiscal house in order. And once again, it wasn't the day to go there. It was like, okay, we just got to get our fiscal house in order. And then I said to her, you know, these safety pins were actually like the ones that the suffragettes used, and they're replicas of ones that were made in World War II, and blah, blah. She said, and she was so kind, she said, oh, well, then we have to use that one. I said, we have these other ones from the dime store. She said, no, we have to use this one. And she was so kind to me. And I tried to be, I didn't try to be, I was respectful. And she was kind. And once again, I walked away, stereotypes that I might be tempted into busted, and I know that they walked away with their stereotypes busted as well. Those two encounters were the most important encounters that I had all weekend. I loved the march. I enjoyed every minute of it. It was like a grown-up version of a child's birthday party. I know a lot of people were there, and you probably felt the same way. But from a spiritual perspective, it was so important for me to have those two encounters with what the Course in Miracles would call my brothers. That place of divine neutrality. And so many people are asking that question today. What do I do with the fact that there are members of my family who voted for Trump, or it might be the members of your family voted not for Trump, or whatever it is, who you might be tempted to judge. Some people are judging Trump voters. Some people are judging those who didn't vote because they said it didn't make a difference. That's willful ignorance. Look at what's happening now. Voted, you know, there's so much temptation to judge now that it makes for a bitchy environment. It's a toxicity that's in the air. And you know, Americans, it's very interesting. If you go to London, if you go to Paris, the city that is the capital of the government is the same as the city that's the capital of the arts, of the philosophy, of the filmmaking, of painters. And so if you go to a dinner party in London, you're liable to be there with a parliamentarian and with someone who is an artist. Same with Paris, a lot of capitals in the world. The United States has a different kind of personality. And our founders knew what they were doing, creating a capital over on the swamp in Washington, D.C., and moving it from New York. Because our psychological DNA is we do not want government in our face. And so the sort of pattern, the psychological pattern in the United States is that every 4 years we know we have to get into it. Every 4 years, we know we have to wake up and pay attention. Sometimes it's fun, sometimes it's not fun. Sometimes our guy wins or our girl wins, sometimes ours doesn't. We put it all together, we go through what we go through, and then when it's over, we're either happy or we're unhappy, and then we get over it, and we don't have to think about it for another 2 years or 4 years. This is different. And we know we have to stay awake. And for those of us who are not like the two gentlemen that I met from Georgia, or the nice, lovely couple that I met from Indiana, this is different. And it feels to many of us like the patriotic duty is to make sure that we do not look away. So I'm reminded of the Dalai Lama when he said that in order to heal the world, we must have a plan, but no plan will work unless we meditate, because on one hand, just as everybody's been saying since the Women's March, what do we do now? What are the strategies? What are the things that we have to do? Those of us who do feel moved in our hearts to resist the more extremist elements of the agenda that is unfolding in front of our eyes. But at the same time, as the Dalai Lama said, no plan will work unless we meditate, and also, if we do not meditate, this will warp our personalities. We will have a very, very difficult time holding the space of that juxtaposition if we do not, in fact, give as much time to, and as much effort and as much energy to our spiritual practice as to our political activism. It's not an either or, it is a both and. And what for me continues to be a beacon of light is those two gentlemen from Georgia and that married couple from Indiana. And if I stray from that place, then I know that my efforts on behalf of the externalized changes will hurt me and will not ultimately serve my country, because everything that we do is infused with the consciousness with which we do it. The way Gandhi put it is the end is inherent in the means. If we are eaten up by anger, then whatever we do will actually end up an angry result. A peaceful and angry generation cannot bring peace to the world. And so as we do our spiritual practice at this time, it does not have to do with ignoring what's happening. It does not have to do with minimizing what's happening. You know, when Paul Revere drove through the country, he didn't drive, but when he rode his horse through the countryside, and he was yelling out, "The British are coming." He was warning people, "The British are coming, the British are coming." He was warning, "The British are coming, the British are coming." We would not have yelled back, "Oh, Paul, you're spreading fear." It was important that he let people know that the British were coming, just as it's important to pour water on a fire. If in fact the house is burning down, you don't think that yelling fire is a negative thing to do. We've talked here before about how many of the great social justice movements, most of the great social justice movements in the history of the United States, emerged from spiritual centers. The abolitionist movement emerged from the Quakers, and many of the leaders of the women's suffragette movement were Quakers. And obviously Dr. Martin Luther King, a Baptist preacher, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Now, what is the significance of this? I often think about the difference between people who were anti-slavery and people who were abolitionists. Now, that's very relevant to the times in which we live, because the person who was anti-slavery was a person who would be just that. They thought slavery was wrong. They thought those southern states were absolutely insane. They couldn't even imagine living in a southern state like, slavery is terrible. But to say that you are against slavery is different than being an abolitionist. Being an abolitionist means you've crossed over. You've crossed over from "ain't this awful" to the best of my ability, it will not happen on my watch. And that is the miraculous transformation. That is what makes a sacred activist. You know, we talk here easily these days. There's so many phrases that get thrown around like sacred activism. But a lot of times what people mean really, if they look deeply at themselves by a term like sacred activism, means that they're into the whole spiritual let's love everybody, but without an ability to say no. You know, we talk here so many times. People will say, when we're having conversations about miracles, they'll say, well, what about boundaries? What about boundaries? Shouldn't you have a boundary against the abuser? Does love mean you let somebody abuse you? Absolutely not, whether he's your husband or he's your president. You do not allow someone to cross a line which you feel transgresses against your own moral values. And to that extent, love is part of a loving response. And love being a part of loving response often includes the word no. Love sometimes says yes, and love sometimes says no. We know that this as parents. The fact that you love your children doesn't mean that you say yes to them no matter what they want. Sometimes you say no. So the person who was an abolitionist went further than just being anti-slavery. It meant that in every way they possibly could, they were part of a larger energy in the country that resisted the reign of slavery and that was absolutely committed to its end. Now, the spiritual perspective involved two pieces. It involved the capacity for a healthy, convicted no, but it also involved the capacity for a faithful, convicted, and miraculously fueled yes. And what is that yes? The yes is, and this is what faith gives you, faith is not blind, faith is visionary. We all know the line that Martin Luther King used to quote, that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. What does that mean? It means that it is the basic template of the universe, which is God's handwriting, that every crucifixion is followed by a resurrection. Every time the Israelites, i.e. the children of God, are enslaved internally or externally by the forces of Pharaoh or ego, they will ultimately be rescued and delivered to the promised land. That is the template, the natural order of the universe. But just as in the New Testament, it's 3 days between the crucifixion and the resurrection, and the Old Testament is 40 years between slavery in Egypt and the deliverance to the promised land. How long that 3 days is up to us. How long that 40 years is up to us. You know, if you see that house burning down, you don't just say a mantra a few times and trust the outcome to God. We need to live our lives in such a way that God can trust the outcome to us. So to say everything will be okay, this is not like a spiritual response to this moment in America. Oh, I'm just leaving the outcome to God. My only job is to love everybody. That is not a spiritual response. There is absolutely no serious spiritual or religious path that gives any of us a pass on addressing the suffering of other sentient beings. And let us make no mistake, the extremist elements of the agenda that is being promulgated in our country today does lead and will continue to lead to the suffering of people and the suffering of animals in ways that any intelligent person, if you think about it, knows. And so the issue is for us to, with every ounce of our being, stand in a no. But we are saying a no to systems. We are not saying no to individuals. We want to keep in mind what is for me, those nice people from Indiana, or so keep in mind that nice couple, the nice couple from Georgia. It's not about demonizing other human beings. It is about saying that something must occur. Just as when a parent gets fiercely protective in your home, if your children, it could be drugs, it could be alcohol, it could be sex, it could be whatever it is, and this thing comes in you, and you just say, that will not be happening in this house. Do you understand me? Do you understand me, young lady, or do you understand me, young man? That will not be happening in this house. That is because you love that child, and it's something fierce that comes up in you. And the joke is, of course, that if they actually challenge you at that point, you don't exactly even know what you would say, but you're so fierce in the way you say it, they're probably not going to challenge you. Well, the love that will save the world today is not just the love for our own children. The love that will save the world is the love also for the children on the other side of town and the children on the other side of the earth. And for us to be caretakers of our home today, it's not enough for you to be a caretaker of your apartment or of your house. In order for us to be caretakers of our home today, it must be the home that we all share. And we must become as fiercely protective of our earth, as fiercely protective of our world, and as fiercely protective of everyone's child as we would be if it were our own child and our own home. And that means absolutely yes, there are times when we do say, don't even come a step closer. Not because we are lost in fear, but because we have embraced such a love. But the yes that comes from the spiritual perspective is the knowing. The resurrection is going to happen. The deliverance of the promised land is going to happen. Buddha's enlightenment under the Bodhi tree was going to happen. So whether you call it the promised land, or resurrection, or enlightenment, or self-actualization, or inner peace, they are all words for the same thing. We are headed to that place. But the issue is it going to be 3 years, or is it going to be 3 lifetimes? How long a period that takes is completely up to us. And how much human and other species suffering has to occur in the meantime is completely up to us. But when you stand on spiritual principle, what you stand on is the absolute knowing that the alternative is possible. I mean, when you look at someone like the abolitionists, how would these people, there were no cell phones, there were no computers, they were facing an institution that was propped up by a huge economy, and that institution had been driven by that economy for something like 300 years. What, on a rational level, what possible hope did they have of ending slavery? Same with women's suffrage. You know, but sometimes we get way too impressed by the majority, you know. But it's not like the majority woke up and said, let's free the slaves. It's not like the majority woke up and said, let's give women the right to vote. The majority is not what changes history. What changes history is a small group of people, usually considered outrageous radicals by the status quo of their time, that have the idea that is more life-sustaining. Now, this is the deal. The social axis of the universe, of change today, is not the horizontal axis, it is the vertical axis. If you're trying to change the world just along the line of the horizontal axis, what you are willing to do is to dumb down your message to get more people to agree with you. You go vertical. You're not trying to get anyone to agree with you. You are going deep, deep, deep into that which you feel in your heart is true, and you deeply commit yourself to that, which at this time includes the commitment to both the spiritual and the political. The spiritual meaning to absolutely surrender to God any personal judgment or demonization of anyone, but at the same time to be very committed every time we wake up in the morning to asking love to use us for what we can do so that we become the resurrective force field. Now, the crucifixion metaphysically means the energy pattern by which that which is not love seeks to invalidate and destroy love. This is hardly the first time in this country that we've had a crucifixion energy. I don't know how much more of a crucifixion energy you can have than slavery. I don't know how much more of a crucifixion energy you could have than white supremacy and institutionalized racism and all the various forms of injustice and oppression, that genocide of the Native Americans, all kinds of energy patterns that this country has had. But at the same time, as important as it is to identify what Lincoln would call our national sins, it is also important that we identify with the generations that rose up in every single case and put America back on track. We want to identify slavery, of course, and the ravages of slavery and the sins of slavery, particularly in the areas where we have still not atoned as a nation on the levels that we need to, made amends on the levels that we need to. But we want to identify with the abolitionists. Of course we want to identify that they didn't even let women have the right to vote, but we want to identify with the women suffragettes. We want to identify what the Jim Crow laws were, what the lynchings were, what white supremacy was segregation in the American South. But we want to identify with the civil rights movement, because the civil rights movement, with Martin Luther King having gone to India, studied the principles of nonviolence as articulated by Gandhi, brought them back to the United States, in order to apply them to the struggle for civil rights at that time, meant that we must be as aware and as dedicated to our own internal purification as we are to external change. And that is why Martin Luther King used to say that the desegregation of the American South is the political externalization of the goal of the civil rights movement, but the ultimate goal, he said, is the establishment of the beloved community. And so that's the question on many people's minds. How do I stay in love? How do I stay in love when I see things I don't like? How do I stay in love when I meet people or have family members or friends who I feel stood for something or voted for something that I find heinous? This is the work of the nonviolent activist. This is not a wheel that needs to be rediscovered, reinvented. This was already articulated by Gandhi, already practiced by King, and in very, very powerful and successful ways. When Lord Mountbatten said to Gandhi when he first met him, he said, "Little man, what do you think? We're going to just give you India?" And Gandhi, because Gandhi knew how the universe operates, Gandhi said, "Yes." He didn't just think it, he knew it. Why? Because he knew, in the terms that were meaningful for him, that in terms of energy and template, every crucifixion is followed by resurrection. It's going to happen. The only issue, because it is too against the natural order of things for it not to happen. The Course in Miracles says God's will has never not been done. The issue is not whether love will ultimately prevail. If we have a nuclear holocaust, God forbid, if we have a nuclear holocaust, and they're like, 15 people left on the planet at the end of that, they will look at each other and go, I think we should do it different this time. I think we should do it differently this time. Something about the way they did it didn't work, you think? Now, what the Course in Miracles says is whether it's an individual issue, and we can extrapolate from that, a collective issue. If your life isn't working, it's because your life is not based on love. That which is within is always expressed without. Everything that happens on the horizontal plane is a reflection of what's happening on the inner plane. So in every area of our life, the Course in Miracles says only what you are not giving can be lacking in any situation. And so you go through your life and you go, okay, what area isn't working? Okay, and you start going through it. Where was I off? Where was I about getting rather than giving? Where was I not my best self? Where did I act angry? Where did I act controlling? Where did I act selfish? Where did I act needy? Where was I dishonest? You go through your own list. And then if you see, well, that threw the universe off there, then you atone for that mistake. You recognize it. You atone for it, whether it's in Catholics who go to confession, or Jews on the day of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the most holy day of the year, or in Alcoholics Anonymous in the 12 steps, where you take that fearless moral inventory, you acknowledge the exact nature of your wrongs, and when you can and how you can, you make amends for them. Well, the United States has many places where we can look and go, wow, what are we surprised at? Because we have not made love our bottom line. We've made economic principles our bottom line. For that matter, Gandhi said, the very idea that economics is a verifiable science is one of the greatest evils ever foisted upon the human race. We have bowed down to money, we have bowed down to economics, and we buy it and we acquiesce to it. And so we have organized our civilization not according to humanitarian principles, not making love the bottom line, but making the bottom line these economic principles that somebody has convinced us are the ones that will work, whether we agree with that particular theory or we believe in somebody else's. And so if you look at everything going on the planet, from a metaphysical perspective, we're surprised. Why? Including everything that's going on with this election, given how many of us have been disengaged from the process. You know, for me, when I go through in my mind, I have to tell you, where my ego, I'm still having a problem and I'm not always all the way there. I understand that, you know, when the outcome of this last election was not, there are people who are alt-right and white supremacists and some really terrible things. And they've always been here, and this time they will harness for political purposes like never before, et cetera. But that of itself does not explain this outcome. And I do believe that there are many people who are very lovely people who simply, you know, when they say all the time, we're a divided nation, we're a divided nation, we're a divided nation. What I experience with those two people from Georgia and those two people from Indiana is that we're not a divided nation. We are a nation, though, where some people look at life through this mental filter and some people look at life through that mental filter. We cannot be divided because God created us all as one. God created us as one. We cannot be divided. And so when we appear divided, it's just because we're looking through a mental filter. So if I'm trying to relate to you through your political views or whatever, then we will seem divided. But if I seek to see the innocence in you, that you might see the innocence in me, and go into that space of divine neutrality, then we're not divided. We're just looking at things through different mental filters. And when you go from that place, you are not whining and you are not angry, because the anger will only diminish and decrease your capacity for really being a vessel of what goes next. But if you're not looking at what's wrong, you're not in transcendence. If you're not looking at what's wrong, you are in denial. So the spiritual activist at this time, the spiritual seeker at this time, is not in denial about the crucifixion here. We are not in denial about some things which are, from an objective perspective, very, very disturbing. And the things that I think are most disturbing, I believe in my heart, are disturbing to the vast majority, would be disturbing to the vast majority of people who voted for Donald Trump as well, because what they were hoping for, their economic cry of despair, as Kellyanne Conway herself said, about some of the things that the president had said. Yes, they are offended, but they're not affected. So we can litigate all that, we can have all those conversations, but I think many of us are at the point now where what we want to know is, how do we change this thing? And how do we change this thing from a spiritual place where we are not eaten up by anger, particularly knowing that if we are coming from a place of anger, as Martin Luther King said, you have very little morally persuasive power with people who can feel your underlying contempt. If we remember that there was genocide of Native Americans in this country, and there was slavery in this country, and there was suppression of women, they had no right to vote, and all kinds of other ways that women have been suppressed and oppressed in this country. We look at what the civil rights movement was responding to. We look at the fact that gays could not marry. All of the things that most of us would certainly, all of us, not all of us, would certainly agree were transgressions against the principles on which we purport to stand. We need to remember that there were people who rose up, no different than us, and they weren't people who were always having a good day. You know, I love to read biographies. I always feel when I read biographies of people, if I just read a history book and this happened and then that happened, that doesn't really feed me. I don't really get it. My brain I glaze over. But if I read a biography, this was the person that lived through this, then somehow you not only understand the period of time better, but you also understand the human beings and what it was to be human during that struggle. You know, a lot has been written about Abraham Lincoln's melancholia, they called it, which we would call depression today. And they thought that the Civil War was going to be over both sides. They thought it was going to be over in 6 weeks. They had no idea it was going to end up to be this horrifying, horrifying explosion of blood that it was. And some of the eyewitness accounts in all of the biographies of Lincoln, talk about how his secretary would come in and report that this many people had been killed in this battle, or this many people had been killed in that battle, this many people killed in that battle. And they said that in the books talk about how Lincoln would put his head in his hands in the middle of like meetings with his cabinet. He would put his head in his hands and he would rock back and forth and say, "I cannot bear it. I cannot bear it." Now, I always remember that image because it reminds us that people who have done great things it wasn't because they had it easy. It wasn't because it was not depressing and painful for them. One of the things my mother used to tell me, she used to remind me, you know, you guys look back at World War II, you know how it ended. She said, we didn't know how it was going to end. She said we had faith that we would win, but remember what that was. This was not like it was all, there were a lot of lost battles on the way to winning that war. And so there are so many ways that it seems to me that on a personality level, there's a saying in AA, every problem comes bearing its own solution. And one of the ways that the problem comes bearing the solution is that it is challenging us and confronting us with our need to become today who we were not before. When I said before that my challenge, my ego, is not in forgiving, quote, who am I to forgive? My job from A Course in Miracles perspective is in withholding my judgment from those who voted for Trump. My ego is more hooked in by people who didn't vote because they said there was no difference, or people who voted in ways that they said, I will not vote for my, I will not vote for my fear, or whatever ways that the places where I'm still stuck in ego would make me, in my own ego arrogance, think you're a bit of the problem. None of us are totally healed on all of this, right, yet. Maybe they are, I'm certainly not. But the point is to know that this is actually confronting us and challenging us to all those places that we have not been to before. A large part of what happened in America today, and if it had not been this person, it would have been someone else, is that so many of us have been disengaged from politics. We've talked about politics like it was some other category over here. I remember when the AIDS crisis exploded on the scene, and we formed the Centers for Living in Los Angeles, and the Centers for Living in New York, and the Project Angel Food, and all the wonderful things that people did to show up for people with AIDS. Why was that? Because there was suffering in our midst. How can you talk about how you're a spiritual seeker, but then kind of ignore the fact that there's suffering in your midst? Love is a verb. It is not just a noun. And so many people in the spiritual community have been our whole conversation about love sometimes is, I want it. How do I get it? We have so many conversations about how do I get love as opposed to how do I give love? How do I give it? We have so many times when we go into a therapy session and the therapist asks you, well, is this relationship really giving you everything you want? As opposed to the therapist asking, are you giving this relationship everything that you have? We do not confront ourselves enough. We do not challenge ourselves enough. That is the spiritual work. The ego, the Course in Miracles is like an ego, is like a scavenger dog. You made a mistake, you made a mistake, you made a mistake. The Course in Miracles says the ego is always on, it's like a scavenger dog seeking any scrap of evidence that your brother did it wrong. We can all do that right now, including to Donald Trump. But that's not the spiritual basis of things. The spiritual basis of things is, where was my part in this? Where have I been disengaged? Where have I been in la-la land about all this? Where was I thinking that politics was somebody else's business? All that politics is our collective behavioral patterns. So if your individual collective pattern means however you think and however you behave is what you're going to get, politics is the same thing. However we collectively think and however collectively behave is how we're going to get. But the Course in Miracles makes it very clear. It says that every problem, time there's a problem, God has an answer to that problem the moment the problem occurs. The universe is both self-organizing, as I say all the time, and it is also self-correcting. So just as there was a generation before us that was able to abolish slavery, and just as there was a generation before us that was able to get women the right to vote, just as there was a generation before us that was able to achieve civil rights legislation and the end to institutionalized segregation, just as there was a generation, this generation, that was able to make sure that gays would be able to marry, and on and on and on and on and on. We're now a generation that will rise up and must rise up and can rise up. That which the Course in Miracles says, that those who have achieved the most on the planet have achieved a fraction of what each and every one of us is capable of. So Lincoln didn't have something in him that we don't have, because the Course in Miracles says Jesus didn't have something in him that the rest of us don't have. This is the time that is inviting us to expand into a dimension of selfhood that we have perhaps not embraced fully before. And that means, number one, it's not just about me. It's not just about me. And this issue that it is just about me is the problem. That's what got us into this mess. What got us into this mess is that mentality, the exaltation of the idea that it's just about me. And many of us, without even admitting it to ourselves, fell into that because we were living in neighborhoods where it was easy enough to do it. We thought that in our own bubble we would be protected. And it's kind of like we knew a lot of suffering was happening, but it was on the other side of town, or it was on the other side of the world, or someone else would take care of it. Even though we might have heard lines like the French when they say that if you don't do politics, politics will do you. We're now living at a time when no matter what the public issue is, it will make its way to your private door. For instance, the edict that came out today, the pick for the new FCC chairman. The new FCC chairman is a known enemy of net neutrality. I mean, if any of us really allow ourselves to think about what that means. Net neutrality means that right now, no matter who you are, you could be a poor person, you could be a rich person. You have a website, somebody can log on and see what you've got to say, see what you've got to sell. Because it's net neutrality. It takes your website as long to come up as it takes some huge multinational corporation's website to come up, right? You get rid of net neutrality, that means they're going to charge money. So that means some huge corporation could afford to have theirs come up quickly, but you, if you cannot afford the money, you go in the slow lane. Do you realize what a threat to democracy this is? So the only people who will have access to the rivers of information and the delivery of information are those who can pay for it. It's not enough that they're the ones who can afford the health care, that not the ones that are the only ones who can afford the education, not enough that they're the only ones who can afford whatever. Now we're talking about the free flow of information. And anybody who is not looking at this is not looking at the fact that as of today, EPA is not supposed to put the news articles about what's going on in climate change. They're no longer allowed to put it up on their site. Agriculture Department, the same thing. Anybody who does not look at this is not transcendence. This is denial. An abolitionist was not someone who refused to look at slavery. People in the civil rights movement did not refuse to look at segregation and white supremacy. If you go to the doctor doesn't say, if you have a broken arm, let's look at that ankle, shall we? We have to look at the wounds. But we look at the wound with an absolute realization and conviction behind the idea that the universe is self-correcting, and that we proclaim and we rejoice in the fact that the moral arc of the universe might be long, but it bends towards justice, and we can do what other generations have done. That's why it's as important that we be happy right now as that we be sad. Some of these things, we've been saying, my latest book, Tears to Triumph, we talk about these collective sadness. I've been talking for years. I wrote that book about the fact that so many people are on meds. I said, why are so many people on antidepressants? Because it's kind of depressing what's going on in this society if you allow yourself to look at it. And one of the things I talk about in that book is that we need to look at it, because if we don't look at it, some terrible things might happen, ergo what has happened. But that's okay. Because sometimes in my own life when I'm so humiliated or embarrassed or self-hating because I got this wrong or I got that wrong, You know, the Course in Miracles says you atone, you go back to that moment, whether it was your disengagement or your anger or your controllingness or your neediness, whatever you did, you atone for it. And then you say, I'm going to wake up in the morning and I'm going to be a better person today. Where I was weak yesterday, I'm going to be strong tomorrow. Where I was in la-la land yesterday, I'm going to be aware today. Where maybe I was like, didn't even know what was going on yesterday, today I'm going to read a newspaper. Where I was acting, even though I'm a grown woman, where I was acting like a little girl, I'm going to be such a woman today. Where I was like a man acting like a little boy yesterday, I'm going to be a grown man today. Where I was just so concerned about my own traumas and my own triggers and my own childhood wounds that I was of value to no one by myself, that was yesterday. That is not who I'm going to be today. And as we do that, that personal transformation has global effects. Because wherever we are in our lives, we vibrate on the frequency of other people who are there too. If all I'm about is my stuff not working, and I really have to work through this, and it's really whatever that stuff is, I'm going to meet people who meet me on that level of frequency, and it's its own self-fulfilling pattern. It will just feed off itself. But even when we don't know where, even if we don't know how, you don't have to know how. It's your conviction to be used. Because I want to tell you something, ladies and gentlemen. Good news and bad news. Bad news. If it's only left to traditional activism and the mortal mind to fix this, we're cooked. We need a miracle. And that miracle, we need some divine intercession here. The weapons of propaganda. I mean, you know, before you had the fact that the slave owners, all the money was in their hands, you know, of big governmental and huge business structures. But today with the technological processes, some of the people whose agendas are the most nefarious are also such manipulators and so good at this political sleight of hand and psychological manipulation. And that's backed by technology. And now they're coming up with technology where the whole fake news thing. No. People who are just trying to fight this by putting your finger in the dike over here and your finger in the dike over there, that's not enough. What's going to break this, what's going to cause the miracle this time, is the same thing that caused the miracle for the abolitionists or the miracle for the suffragettes. You know, when the D-Day invasion occurred, you know, I love reading about World War II and particularly the D-Day invasion because it was just unbelievable. Some of the things that just happened to be true that day, without which it would have been very, very difficult. It was very difficult as it was for the Allies to win. But some of the German commanders who, you know, one just happened, his wife's birthday was that day. So he said, well, you know, I think I have the time. I'm going to go home and tell my wife happy birthday. And if he had been there, the Germans would have been able to be so much more in position. So the universe is supporting us. The universe is supporting us. The United States of America is a grand experiment. It is a grand forward-moving opportunity in the history of the world, not just in the political history of the world, but in the spiritual history of the world. I was at a church the other day. I spoke at a church in Washington, D.C., and it's primarily a black church, and they have a huge, gorgeous choir. And most of the members of the choir are black. And the first song that they sang was, I think it's My Country 'Tis of Thee, and the line, land where my fathers died, land of the Pilgrim's pride. And I'm listening to these incredible black singers singing about their love for America, land where my fathers died. Now, my thought was, well, yeah, we know how your fathers died. And my thought was, what forgiveness and what generosity it takes for a black person to sing that song. Because if you're singing your love for America when it's land where your fathers died, and so many of your grandfathers and grandfathers died as slaves, and some of your sons are dying today, the generosity and the forgiveness of singing that song. And yet, when I said to that choir, I know what you're doing. You're singing to the ideal. That's what we love about America. We don't have any like it's never had these horrible, horrible wounds and horrible, horrible places where we've done the exact opposite of everything that we purport to stand on. But our trajectory is that there are those who, despite it all, seek to make things right, seek to move it in the higher direction. And that is what we love. We love the ideal. And we know that in every generation, there have been those who sought to use the resources of the country to move against the ideas like freedom. If you're working against net neutrality, you're working against democracy. Louis Brandeis, who was a Supreme Court justice, said, you can have large amounts of money in the hands of a very few, or you can have democracy, you cannot have both. And so many of these things that we're talking about, when Martin Luther King said, if you don't have a cause worth dying for, you don't yet have a life worth living. There were people in our history for whom these things were like, no, we're willing to die for this. Now, the Course in Miracles, he says, I'm not looking for martyrs, I'm looking for teachers. This isn't about any of us wanting to go to die for any of this, and we won't have to if enough of us are creatively disruptive and loving enough of what is possible that we keep our eye on that ball. And that will give us strength. And it will give us the most amazing situations and opportunities. In my life, it was the universe making sure that I met those two men from Georgia. And the universe making sure that I met that lady, that couple from Indiana. That I don't wish them any harm, and I got it. I can come from that place. And from that place, know that we can speak to the conscience of America. We can speak to the goodness of America. You know, some people only talk about what America's done right and doesn't want to look at what America's done wrong. And they think anybody that points at what we've done wrong or that we are doing wrong, pointing to the evils of mass incarceration, talking to some of the terrible episodes and patterns of injustice that we are among us even now, they say we're bashing America. But then there are other people who just want to talk about what's wrong with America as though we've never done anything right, as though we've never had the abolitionist movement, as though we've never had the women's suffragette movement and the civil rights movement. But that's like going to a therapist who only wants to talk to you about what you did wrong, or a therapist who only wants to talk to you about what you did right. If your therapist only talks to you about what you did wrong, you're at the wrong therapist. But if you're with a therapist who only talks to you about what you did right, you're also at the wrong therapist. It's time in our mature places and our mature years that we want people to work with us on both. Where do I get it wrong, and how can I be better? And where have I gotten it right, and where can I own that without apology and celebrate that? So this is an extraordinary time in history. We must own what's wrong, and we must celebrate what's right. And we must have the courage, and we must have the decency, and we must have the patriotism to point out what's wrong, to point out our no, to yes, practice boundaries, to yes, set the boundaries, to yes, be very clear about this being a line past which we will not go. But if we are truly to be the miracle workers that are necessary at this time, we are also honoring the ancestors who laid out the template. Not only the ancestors like the Jesus or the Moses or the Buddha, they have certainly laid out the template of living in infinite possibility, but even those who, following the spiritual creeds of the world, like the great social justice operatives of which I have spoken, stood within the space of possibility, infinite possibility. And this idea of America, that is what we stand for. Not the temporal, not that we've always gotten it right or that we've always gotten it wrong, but the eternal idea that there would be a place where self-actualization is possible, that we would deem it an important enough thing to give our lives to this notion, that it won't be just a few people who can have education. It won't be just a few people who can have wealth. It won't be just a few people that have the opportunity for wealth creation. It won't be just a few people who have an opportunity to get into the game. It won't be just a few people who have the voting franchise, while other people have their voting franchise suppressed and more suppressed all the time. It won't be just a few people who have the right to believe that they can get in the game and make it. It will be, to the best of our ability, everybody. And when we see forces arising in our generation as they have arisen throughout our history that want to limit that franchise and say, no, just a few people who want to revert to an aristocratic system, who want to revert to the notion that just a few people will be able to have these opportunities, and then everybody else becomes more and more, day by day, more of an economic and social serf. It is a loving thing to do. Just like it's love that says to your kids, no, that's not going to go on in this house. It is love that makes you save that house if that house is on fire. It is love that makes you yell fire if, in fact, the house is burning down. And when your country is that house, and it is burning down in some way, and your democracy itself is being dismantled in some ways in front of your eyes, darn right you're not going to be a coward about it. Darn right you're not going to, not mention it. Darn right you're not going to go to a dinner table where they say, we're not going to talk about religion or politics. I've always felt about that one. That so leaves me out at dinner. What else is there to talk about? We're a generation that has been obsessed by the meaningless. We're a generation that has been distracted distracted. We have been distracted by things that are ultimately about nothing. And when we hear our friends going on and on about small problems, we're not going to coddle each other. We're not going to coddle it in ourselves, and we're not going to coddle it in each other. We might say, have you meditated today? But if we need to, we might look at each other in a way, words don't even have to come out. Why don't you just think about being a grown woman? Why don't you just think about being a grown man? You know what my vision is for American women? We should live on a planet, given the extraordinary power of American women, that we live in the most powerful country in the world, our financial power and our voting power. We could, and I believe should, live on a planet where some of the worst things that could be contemplated, there would be people all over this world who could actually legitimately, validly have a reason to say to each other, we don't have to worry about that, because American women would never let that happen. That is who we should be. That is who we should be. And anything less than that, what are we doing? And why are we so surprised? Why are we so surprised? You know, there comes a time in life when, just like it's sad when children don't get to have their childhood, there's something sad about adults who somehow miss their adulthood. And I think at a certain point, when you've been to the party, as good as the party might be, there's time, it comes a time when the party's over. When if you stay too long at the party, it's just like not cool to be there any longer. We partied. We cannot say we did not party. We went to the party. And now we need to stand up as people who know that not every hour of the day is party time. And it's not an either or, it's both and. We will celebrate the possibilities of where we're going, but we will also name the dangers that are in our midst. And if we do, with hatred towards none, as Abraham Lincoln said, with malice towards none, with charity for all. That's what he was talking. He was talking about the people of the South. They would not be treated as a vanquished enemy, but as brothers who had returned home. Unfortunately, he died shortly thereafter, and that is not how the North treated the South, and that caused the terrible, terrible problems that it did. But if we can own this and hold to this and do our best to be people, the people that we are capable of being, once again, every problem comes bearing its own solution. Why did this happen? Because we weren't who we might have been. Let us be who we might be now. And it's not like we're going to fix this, but God, through us, is going to correct this nation, because the universe is self-correcting, because there is no problem. The Course in Miracles, the first line in the Course, there is no order of difficulty in miracles. This idea is so important. It is so much more important than you. It is so much important than you. It is so much more important than me. To honor our ancestors, to honor the fact that they stood up in their time, to honor our children and our children's children and our descendants by being people who will stand up in our time, then we will not be worried about all the ways in which there are threats to the greater good of this country or to democracy itself, because we will absolutely know that there's a power greater than the power of money. There is a power greater than the power of technology. There is a power greater than the power of the presidency. There is something greater than the power of the Supreme Court. There is something greater than the power of Congress. There is power greater than any of the powers of the world. It lives in us. As Martin Luther King said, there is a power in you more powerful than the power of bullets. And when we stand on that power, willing to say no to what must be said no to, and willing to say yes to the love which will then flow through us and lift us up and put us into collaborative possibilities with each other that are infinite, that are exciting, that are high frequency, that are actually like fun, then we will know that being an adult is actually a cool thing. It's fun to do this, and saving our country will be something that we enjoy doing. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You were very kind to me. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Really, truly, thank you. So, once again, in order to save the world, we must have a plan. No plan will work unless we meditate. Because when we meditate, we go into the quantum realm of infinite possibility. As we said before, if you're only thinking in terms of external remedies can only take you so far. So when Dr. King said the desegregation of the American South is the political externalized political goal of the civil rights movement, but the ultimate goal is the establishment of the beloved community. It's because if it's only about external change, as important as those external changes might be, it's like symptoms of a disease that can then morph. He got the Voting Rights Act, now they're chipping away at the Voting Rights Act. They achieved a state where people agreed, there was a national agreement that expansion of the voting franchise really should be the goal of a democracy, and now we are living at a time, even in this last election, around the country, 800 polling places had been eradicated. So we know that you must get to the causal level where we recognize that our love for each other, when this whole thing starts over, that love is the basis of all of our decision making. So that is where meditation takes us. That is where prayer takes us. Prayer aligns us with a capacity that takes us beyond just that 10% of the brain cells that we have talked about, that everybody talks about. It means that you are more likely to find yourself sitting next to somebody or talking to somebody with whom you can work in collaboration. Everything becomes infused with meaning. And so when we go into these sacred places within, we take our direction and we take our guidance from what the Course in Miracles calls the voice for God. So when we go into the silent place within ourselves now and we pray for our country and we pray for our world, we do so from a place of surrendering ourselves that we might be used by love as part of the resurrective impulse of the universe, as part of the healing, as part of the miracle. And so this is where you listen. You know, when you're in a place like this, really listen to yourself. When you are joined in prayer with other people, it's very difficult to lie to yourself. So I don't know what you're going to hear that voice within say while we are in this. I don't know if it's going to be a real insight or if it's going to be just a feeling of realignment. I don't know what it is, but this is the time where we look within. So many times we say, well, we know the answers are within, but we don't have the muscles of listening to the voice within. We don't have the attitudinal musculature. So together we close our eyes. And closing our eyes, we seek the presence of the divine, which is not elsewhere, it is here. It is closer than our breath to us. It is the very ground of our being. It is that in which and through which we live. And we place our lives in God's hands. We place our lives in God's hands and ask to be healed and to be repaired and to be prepared, to be made ready, that God Himself might use us as vessels of repair. Dear God, we know You know where we have been weak and where we have been strong, where we have been obsessed with the unimportant, where we have been distracted from a sense of divine mission, where we have not been the people that we might have been. And for this we do atone. And now, dear God, at this time, for our own sake and for the sake of our country and the sake of our world, for the sake of all living things now and unto eternity, we place our lives in Your hands. And we pray that Your Spirit come upon us and lift us up. Lift us out of the mire of our own self-centeredness and narrow-mindedness and littleness and grandiosity. Remove from us the scourge of addiction or mental habit patterns that do not serve, emotional patterns that do not serve. We place in your hands all of our relationships. And we pray, dear God, that you help us become better human beings. Strong where we have been weak. Loving where we have been fearful. Brave where we have been cowardly. Strong where we have been weak. And now we feel a divine elixir of God's love pouring forth upon us. We feel the elixir of God's love as it moves through our head, our torso, our arms and our legs. The elixir of God's love now entering every cell of our being. Restoring our bones, our organs, our muscles, our blood. Restoring and revitalizing our physical body. May our physical body, our emotions, our thoughts, our hearts, our souls become aligned, dear God, with you, that we might be vessels through which you operate, purified of the smallness and the fears of our former selves. May we be lifted to magnitude, to grandeur. Prepare us that we might become better at forgiveness, better at mercy, better at compassion, more ready to atone for our own errors, more ready to forgive others for theirs. Post angels around us that we might be more dutiful in our practice, our prayers, our vigilance, our meditations. Protect and bless this quiet, sacred place within us. Open our ears that we might hear. Tell us, dear God, what you would have us know. Whisper in our ears what you would have us hear. Open our inner eye that we might see the beauty in each other, the innocence in each other. We pray for our president. We pray for his happiness. We ask you, dear God, to dissolve all barriers to our love for him. And we move into that place where we accept without reservation any with whom we disagree. Knowing that our own personal judgment does not serve. And from this place, when we emerge, dear God, into the outer world, may we be who you would have us be, that we might do what you would have us do. For one era and chapter of our lives is over. A new one has begun. And may we experience the joy of knowing this is who I was always meant to be. Standing strong in deep humility before the power of God within us, seeking only the innocence in everyone we meet, ready to do what God would have us do, that through the auspices of His love and His power and His glory, we might work the miracles He sends us to work. And so it is that we are joined together in a great emergent day. Love will cast out all fear. Peace shall cast out all war. Light shall cast out all darkness. For such is the greatness of God. Dear God, we place all of our personal burdens and fears in your hands. And we place in your hands the burdens of our country and of our world. Guide us. Direct us. Pave a path before us. And so it is. Together, we all say, Amen.